end. So everyone, welcome to another Friends from the Field webinar. This is a series that's co-hosted by Blue Hill Heritage Trust, which, if you're unfamiliar, is a community conservation organization for the Blue Hill Peninsula, and Island Heritage Trust, which is a land trust for Deer Isle, Stonington, and the surrounding islands. And my name's Lander, and I'm the outreach coordinator for Blue Hill Heritage Trust. And then we have Noelle here, who's the outreach coordinator for Island Heritage Trust. And today we're so excited to be hosting Heather and Anna from the Wild Seed Project. And the Wild Seed Project has been around for 8 years now, and they do work all across Maine. And today we're focusing on the manual that they created with the Maine DOT. So I'm super excited to learn more. And Heather will introduce herself and share all about this project. So before we get started, I'm going to pass it over to Noelle, and she's just going to tell you how to use the chat box and how we'll do a question and answer at the end. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, everyone. Heather and Anna, so nice to meet you both. My name's Noelle. I'm the new outreach manager at Island Heritage Trust for, I think this is my 4th week. So getting in the groove, so happy to be here. We will do a question and answer with Heather at the end. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box during the conversation, or just hold on to them until the end of the conversation. And at the end, you could also utilize the raise your hand button at the bottom of your screen, and we can call on you to hear from you.
Awesome. Thank you, Noelle. All right, we'll pass it over to Heather and Anna. Thank you both so much for being here tonight.
So thank you. So shall I share my screen now?
Yes, go for it.
A minute. Let me get it.
And I assume that Heather's screen will come up as like the big picture for everyone on their screens. But if it doesn't, you can go up to a little button on the right-hand corner of your screen, if it's the same as my screen, that says view. And you can, I think you can click speaker, and that should have Heather in full focus instead of the rest of our faces, if you have one of ours as the big one.
Are you seeing it now?
I am. Yep, there it is.
Great, thank you very much. Well, I'm really happy to be here, and you can also see Anna Fielkoff, our ecological programs manager from Wild Seed Project, and I was living in Brooksville when I founded Wild Seed Project, so I know the peninsula and all these land trusts well. And I'm really excited to get to tell you the story and show you the wonderful resource in the manual we created for the Maine DOT, because there's so many opportunities in Maine to restore native habitat. There's over 16,000 miles of roadway in Maine. About half of that is under the jurisdiction of the DOT. The other half is, either managed by towns or private landowners. So that is provides a lot of opportunities for all of us. And so in 2016, Wild Seed Project received a grant from the Maine Department of Transportation to create a guide to restore native plant habitat to be used by the DOT road managers. And they also wanted it as a free resource for communities and individuals. And earlier that year, the Federal Highway Administration had made a big announcement and recognized that our nation's highways could provide critical pollinator habitat. They came out with a best practices manual and asked that all the nation's roadways, and particularly the DOTs and highways, focus on creating native habitat. Now, many states had already been doing this. Actually, in the 1960s, Texas, believe it or not, led the way with Lady Bird Johnson and the in her the wildflower centers that she founded in Texas. So if you were to land in an airplane right now in Houston or Dallas, you would actually see all the beautiful Texas roadside wildflowers literally on the side of the runway, not to mention all the roadways. You know, other states that have been doing this for a couple decades are Iowa, Michigan, and Florida, and Virginia have particularly stepped up the game on all of this. So this is happening in other places. And 5 years ago, when the Maine DOT asked us to apply for this grant to create this manual, they were wanting to become part of this and perhaps even be a leader in it. And the benefits are, you know, for those of us who are environmental, pretty obvious. But, you know, they're huge reduction in mowing costs. You know, the line item for mowing is quite high. And it's pretty hard actually to get a lot of roadside managers to actually give you that number. But these are big machines with a lot of fossil fuels and employees, and we've all seen them out there mowing all the times. And then of course the environmental benefit to less mowing. And it also, the other benefit of this reduced mowing would be to free up the roadside crews to manage, you know, the ever increasing invasive species. You know, another obvious benefit is, of course, the increase of native habitat for pollinating insects. And because our roadways crisscross our landscape, they do represent, you know, very important potential migration corridors. And so that's a huge benefit. And then, of course, you know, the beauty of all of our native plants that most of us don't get to see a lot. So I want to acknowledge Bob Mooseman. He was the DOT vegetation manager who first, I met at a conference and approached me and encouraged Wild Seed Project to apply for this grant, which we then received. And then I was the author for the manual, and I worked side by side with Catherine Dillon and Lisa Look, both who were at Wild Seed Project. Catherine did all the design and layout, and Lisa curated all the pictures and created a lot of our fun images. And then there was also a lot of other people who volunteered to help on it, from volunteer proofreaders to the two state botanists, Nancy Olmsted and Don Cameron, who I reviewed all the list of species I created, and then they proofread through everything and gave me their 2 cents. So this, you know, was truly a collaborative effort. And we had 2 years to create the manual, and it was published in January of 2018. Now, our roadways, you know, provide a lot of potential habitat. You know, if you think of those 16,000 miles of roadway, but most of the time they're, you know, mown like turf. And it wasn't always this way. It was in the 70s that you know, the riding mower and the big mowing machines became, you know, really got out there and started mowing the roadways. And so now we've really ended up with this practice of mowing them all the time and treating them like turf. You know, sometimes they're even paved over, these little narrow strips where people think, oh, the grass won't grow well there, so they just pave it over, where in reality we have lots of small dryland species that would thrive in these little median strips. And then in areas where you know, they don't mow as often and you do see wildflowers blooming, what most people don't realize is a lot of the vegetation in our open areas, especially roadways and former agricultural lands, those are, you know, 2/3 of the species are not native species. And, you know, sometimes they're benign ones like buttercup or oxeye daisy, Queen Anne's lace, clover, you know, that still provide nectar and pollen for pollinators. They don't provide the year-round habitat. But the other yellow one you're seeing in this is the rabbit-foot clover. Those are pretty common on our roadsides. And the reason those one can survive is they can tolerate the mid-season mowing. The other, and those are all species from Europe and Asia. The other common wildflower that people see on the side of the road and love is the blue lupine. And what most people in Maine don't realize, that is not a native species. It's actually from Northern California, Oregon, and Washington, and is a garden escapee. And the actual state natural heritage program does consider it an invasive species. And then of course we have lots of more aggressive invasive species on the roadside, like the Eurasian honeysuckles, bittersweet, lots of Japanese knotweed. In southern Maine, there's a lot of black swallowwort. And these are the species that really spread aggressively and push out native species. They don't play well with other species. In this picture, you also see a little bit of black-eyed coneflower, Rudbeckia Herta, which is a Eastern North American species. And it's one of the few natives that can sort of tolerate how we've been managing the roadsides, which is with frequent mowing. Then, in rural Maine, and this picture is from the Blue Hill Peninsula, we do still have quite a few native plants on the side of the road. Here's a little bit of bunchberry, and there's fern and wild strawberry. But unfortunately, these areas typically get mowed sometime in the middle of the growing season, and so often the native flowers or seeds get mowed down before they've had a chance to ripen. And so the guide, if I were to summarize the guide, what do you need to know to create native habitat on a roadside? It's the first message is it's all about the mowing. For our native plants to thrive on our roadsides, the current mowing regime, which is where they're mowed one or more times during the growing season, often as early as June or July, and most frequently then in August and September, is too early and is setting back our native species and favoring the exotics. That mid-season mowing is, favors the Eurasian grasses, which, after you mow, you see bright green grass come in, and that's like stimulating those species. And for the native plants and all the wildlife that live there, that's the equivalent of a clear cut in the middle of the summer. One of the reasons the roadside people often say they need to mow in the middle of the growing season is for sight lines. And in reality, in most situations, they just need one mowing strip right on the side of the highway. Now, when you look at the side of the road, there's a couple different areas that the DOT thinks about in their managing. One is called the inslope, and that's the area right next to the paving, and it slopes away down usually to a ditch, and then it turns up and goes off and higher, and that's called the back slope. And Bob Mooseman from the DOT said he really wanted to treat the back slope, that farther away area, let that return to shrubs, much the way in the 80s, the power line people throughout New England stopped mowing the power lines and over time have selected for shrub habitat. And over time, it becomes very stable. In the beginning, the power lines used a lot of herbicides, but now they're very low maintenance areas. So that was the idea, that wanted to let there be the back slope be more permanent shrubby vegetation. And it's the area along the road that right now often gets mowed one or several times during the growing season. And one of the other reasons that's often, they say they need to do that is to keep deer out of the way so that you can see deer. But the reality is, and there's plenty of research data to show this, after you mow, wildlife come in and eat the newly sprouting vegetation that actually brings the deer out of the shrubs, the higher vegetation, and into the low area. You often see in Maine turkeys in that area too, right after it's been mown. And then of course the sight lines, there are always going to be areas like when you're getting on a ramp onto a road, you do need good visibility to your left. So obviously those areas are going to be needed to mow more often. And then changing the mowing regime. And then the other thing is how the native seeds are handled, what it takes to both encourage the existing native plants to flower and have seed ripening, and also if people want to reestablish, because the seed ripening for native species is very different from the conservation mixes that most road crews use and sow on the side of the road. Those are mostly exotic species that can, those seeds can be, stored at room temperature for months or years on end, and they can be sown anytime. That's just not true with the native species. And it's important to understand how they're handled. And for instance, here's a picture of little bluestem, which is very common in southern Maine on the side of the road. And it tends to start blooming in August, and the seed ripens usually later in September, but yet right when they start blooming, often the road crews come in and mow it and prevent it from reproducing. Or then lots of our beautiful wildflowers, the seeds don't ripen until September, October, and November. So New England aster is one of the last seeds that I collect the seeds of, and this picture was taken in early October. And so these seeds aren't ripened until November. So when you're mowing the area in September or October, you're not letting the native species reproduce. So now what I want to do is show you some actual pages from the guide and walk you through the information so that you can understand what a great resource it is and think about how you might use it. So the guide covers we covered about 70 species. About half of them are woody, shrubby plants, and the other half are herbaceous species, mostly flowering perennials. We did do a handful of grasses. There was more information out there by other states on the native grasses. So the DOT and we chose not to focus on them because we felt like that information was there. And so we broke the guide into 3 sections: the early season, things that bloomed early in the season, mid-season, and late season. That way you could go through and make sure in all your habitat that you had things blooming, throughout the season. That's really important. If you look at the top on the right side of the page, it says workhorse. That's a word that's used in the restoration and road crews world for meaning species that are easy to establish. And we wanted to make sure that we had plenty of the species that would be most easy to both encourage naturally occurring populations and for replanting. And so golden Alexander's is one of those workhorse species. So on each page, we included the height of the plant, where it grows, where its natural habitat is. Many species also thrive in disturbed areas. So we wanted to, describe that. So it says disturbed areas. And then for the other information, we wanted a lot of visuals in this guide. We didn't want it to have too many words. In fact, some of the other manuals on restoring native plants that have been done by other people in other states are either very academic or really wordy. And we knew if practitioners were going to be able to use these guides, we wanted to have really great pictures and visuals so that people could quickly get the information. So for the growing, so we want people to always know where the natural habitat is And then think about the growing conditions, because when you are choosing to plant, the first thing you need to assess is what are the site's growing conditions. So, in this case, sun part shade, and then who the soil type, and then what are the different wildlife that, particularly the pollinators that this plant supports. And remember that native plants, it's not just the flowers and nectar that support the pollinators and other wildlife. It's also the stems and foliage provide habitat or food for lots of other creatures. So it's not just the nectar and pollen that we're after. And then, of course, the bloom time, a little more specifically than the general season of bloom, and then the mowing strategy. And when you go through the whole guide, every page, the mowing strategy is always sometime in the dormant season. And this requires a huge shift, because it's really because of, with agriculture, people think that you need to, because when you're harvesting hay, of course you need to mow it in the middle of the growing season. But that's where this mowing in the middle of the season happened, where people have gotten in the habit of that. So getting people to understand the window for mowing, and any time in the winter. And in Maine, a lot of our roadsides are wet, and that, ideally more of the habitat would be mowed in the spring, but often it's too wet, which means they are going to have to do it in the fall, and ideally also leaving some areas unmown for overwintering habitat for a lot of creatures. And then the other thing this guide does is really give good information on the flowering and seed ripening, and then how to store the seed, because that is critical. And I will talk about this a little bit more in the end. And so we've got pictures of what the seeds look like, when they're ripe, the flower. Sometimes we had pictures of seed pods. So here's an example of a easy to grow early season species. Then, late spring, early summer, blue flag iris. And in fact, this is a really great example of one of our wonderful native perennials that's very common on roadsides and wet meadow ditches, but it blooms in June, but the seed pod doesn't ripen until later in September. And usually these areas get mowed in July or August. So even though this is a perennial species, so if the seeds get cut off one year, that wouldn't matter, but over time, this is leading to the dying out of these native perennial populations. So again, height of the plant, where it grows in the wild, what disturbed areas it would do well in, the growing conditions, when to mow it, and then the seed collection information. And then a late season one, like New England aster. And literally these seeds, often I don't collect till the first or second week in November. I did include a few species, so you'll notice this one doesn't have the word workhorse at the top. This is wood lily, this and our Canada lily are two of our really beautiful open land wildflowers that have populations have really disappeared in the last 30 years. Some of it's from deer browsing, a lot of it's from, this species used to be in a lot of blueberry meadows, but now they're so heavily treated with herbicides and burned so frequently that it's really set this one back. But this isn't one that I was expecting that people would be seeding in. It is just not common enough at this point, but I wanted to have a few of these more challenging species just to educate people. And if you see this plant growing, take a look at when these seeds are ripening and make sure you don't mow that area before those pods have dispersed their seeds. Then we also did a lot of shrubs, and the information how we handled the shrubs was lots of the ones that we included, many shrubs are colonizing, where they reproduce from seed, but they also reproduce vegetatively and make a colony. So that's outlined. And then also some shrubs can handle regular mowing, and yellow bush honeysuckle, bayberry, wild rose. Those are a couple that you could mow every year and they wouldn't mind. Other species you can do on a 3 to 10 year rotation. So that information is in here. Okay, then the next part of the guide is, includes a lot of design ideas. So here's a really typical roadside situation where right now it's just mown as turf. And you've got the area next to the road that would be called the inslope, and maybe one width of it still needs to be mowed. But then there's a low wet area, and then there's the back slope that's sort of behind the pictures of all the people. I'm sorry, people probably can't see that very well. So this is a perfect situation where that ditch could be planted with, wild iris, boneset, marsh marigold, swamp milkweed, Joe Pye weed, asters, sedges, golden groundsel, lots of beautiful flowering perennials. And then there's plenty of wetland shrubs that could grow in there too. And then the back slope, which leads up to some white pine, so a dry area that could be planted with different shrubs such as the yellow bush honeysuckle or sweet fern, bayberry, aronia, chokeberry, meadowsweet. So there's several pages in the guide with different combinations of the native species that can grow in different growing conditions. So that information was on each species page, but if you had a site, you could go look, what could I plant in a dry site, get the whole list, and then go flip through the guide and look at the individual species pages. And then the final piece is the correct information about handling the seeds, both how to judge when the seeds are ripe, how to collect, how to store the seeds, and then the seed sowing needs. And always, everybody has this image that we're going to have all this native seed that we can just seed into the side of the road. Well, when you to seed a site, site bare of vegetation takes a full growing season at least to prepare the site. You have to get rid of all the weeds, whether they're perennial weeds or annuals. You really have to spend a full growing season preparing the site. And so this walks you through the process of how to do that. And then you sow the seeds in the late fall, because lots of our native species, the seeds must have a winter cold period outside to germinate. And so before I walk you through the sowing, how native seeds are sowed, I just want to outline the protocols for ethical collecting of native seeds. And this is also in the guide. So that, the first step is correctly identifying the species when it's in bloom. And one of the reasons it would be so wonderful to have less, the natives restored on our roadsides is this could be a huge source of future native seeds. Right now we first have to release those areas from mowing to see what's even growing there. But before you ever even think about collecting seeds, you need to see it when it's in bloom and make sure you've correctly identified the species, and there's plenty of great information. You can go to the Go Botany website. This is from the guide. It's now called the Native Plant Trust. That's an excellent website to help you identify species. And you need to make sure that it's a common species and it's not a rare protected species, because that is illegal to collect those seeds. So you need to first scout it out. Then if it is not your land, then you absolutely need to ask for permission. And typically parks, and whether they're national or state parks, and even a lot of conservation land, you can't just go collect the seeds off of it, because if everybody did that, there would be no seeds left there. Then, assuming you've both correctly identified the species and are sure it's not rare and have permission, then you need to, before you collect the seeds, you need to actually research when the seeds are ripe and how you'll handle those seeds when you collect them, because some species, the seeds need to be collected and stored in a paper bag. Others need to be kept moist and cleaned of their fleshy fruit. That's true of a lot of berries particularly, and clean that flesh off the fruit. Again, this is all walked through in detail in the guide. And so don't collect seeds without knowing how you're going to handle that seed, because the worst thing people can do is collect seeds and then not handle them correctly and destroy them. Our native plants are already losing their place. They don't need people doing that. And then you also want to make sure you've got a healthy population that you're collecting the seeds from. So that's typically at least 50 individuals, and you would only collect a very modest amount of seed, 5%, 25%. I even think that number is high with how loss is happening on our roads, on our in our landscapes now. So just make sure that you have done that. Again, this resource is all in the area. And so then again, everybody wants to be able to sow in situ, in an existing situation, but you've really got to take the time to prepare the site properly. And a much more efficient use of our native seeds is to propagate them outdoors in a little nursery. And the Wild Seed Project website is filled with information on how to do this, and it's also in our guide. And here's an example of 9 different species. You can see in these little 4-inch pots, there's at least 100 seedlings in each little 4-inch pots. They were all sown outdoors in late December, and then they germinate in the spring. I'm in Portland, so remember it's warmer down here, but I've already got about 60 different species that have germinated here in Portland. A lot of them will germinate early in the spring. And then those can be grown on as plugs and then planted out in September. And so even on our roadsides, they could just pick small areas where they introduce, do a plug planting and let those plants mature and then seed in and expand into the rest of the area. Now, what's the progress that's been happened? So this guide came out in January of 2018. The original plan with Bob Moosman from the DOT, he was really hoping to have a couple years of, winter training sessions for all his staff, but he has since retired. And I can't say that I've seen a big shift in the mowing. I still see a lot of the roadside mowed in late July, August, and September. It seems hard to change mowing habits. This guide was distributed to DOT employees in lots of other states. I've been at a lot of conferences and people say how excited they are to see what's happening in Maine with restoring the roadsides because they've seen our guide. At Wild Seed Project, we are a very young organization. We haven't had a lot of staff, but we have grown a lot. And we now have 8 people working at Wild Seed Project, including a brand new AmeriCorps intern who's listening to this talk right now. And a big part of their job is to start working with municipalities to help make them aware of this resource and guide them on how to do it. And then I'm really looking to you all of us who live in Maine, live in towns. The other half of the roads are taken care of by either private landowners or local communities. You can go speak to your town managers and say, hey, do you know about the free resource? You can go to the Wild Seed Project website, print out our guide, print it out in color. It's beautiful. Staple it together and give it to your town land managers and encourage them to get to change their mowing and not start doing the mowing till late October at the earliest. And instead, all the mowing that can happen can be focused on mowing. We got plenty of invasives on the side of the road, that all that mowing energy could go into mowing them. And with that, I'd love to turn it over to the questions, because I'm sure people have a lot of questions and a lot of brilliant ideas on how to get this out there in the world. I just wanted to point out this picture on the left. So in one of our publication, Wild Seed, this was some artwork we had done. It was the year we were working on the guide, and we had the cover of Wild Seed. We wanted to show an image of what we wish the side of the road looked like. And so I just want to point out, there's right on the low part on the side of the road, there's wild strawberry and pussy toes. There's then our native lupine, Lupinus perennis, which is actually extinct in Maine, but it will thrive in sunny, dry areas on the side of the road. And there's a little blue vervain and Joe Pyeweed and black-eyed coneflower. So this is what I would like to see on the side of the road. And I have seen this pre-COVID. I'm a well-traveled person. I have seen other parts of the country and in Europe. This is happening. This is doable. And it will be cheaper. It's expensive to mow. And luckily now everybody knows we need to get off those fossil fuel-based machines more. So this could happen. And I'm looking to everybody here to help us push it along. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather. So inspiring. I just want to go to the town office right now with your guide and start a conversation. So wonderful to hear about your project. And we have a question in the chat box, so we can dig right in. Noelle, did you want to say anything before we dig into questions?
Just thank you. Thank you for casting such a beautiful and attainable vision for all of us to get involved in spaces that we see every single day.
Awesome. Thank you. So Noelle and I will kind of just alternate asking questions from the chat box. If you have one, plop it in there. The first one is, was there any discussion about the practice of regularly digging out roadside ditches? For fear they'll fill in, I guess, and seeding them?
Well, I think Maine is one of the only states that does that practice. I think it's crazy. It's dangerous. You can't walk or bike on the side of the road. No, we didn't tackle that, but I find it very upsetting. I mean, that it has been documented. That is how so many invasives have spread, because they bring the gravel in and it has Japanese knotweed. But just from a dangerous standpoint, it's all done to keep the roads dry in the winter. But I bet more people are injured going off the road in one of those huge ditches. And then I get very upset because I see all the, I'm a very good roadside botanist driving down the road, and I see all these incredible plants, and then I come back and they've all been gouged out. So no, I didn't tackle that with it, but they do not do this in other states with snow. I'll tell you that.
Thank you for answering that, Heather. That's really interesting.
I can read the next one from, I think, Jerry. This is a kind of multi-part question, so I'll just start with the beginning of it. Towns often use a spray application of grasses when reseeding. Are there spray applications using some of the native grasses rather than those that are generally available in the sprays?
So in general, for native plants, those spraying, especially with that sort of sawdusty stuff, doesn't work well. It certainly doesn't. You can't use it for the flowering plants. Grasses, because they come up like a little spear, they can go up through it. So the one native grass that is sometimes used in those conservation mixes, which is Canada Wild Rye. So you probably could do it, again, the grasses that are in the guide are just the really easy and abundant one, Cantaloupe, Wild Rye, little Bluestem, switchgrass. You could do it for them. You could use just the grasses for that, but you can't use it for any other flowering plants. They can't come up. It makes that like thick, crusty stuff. I do think now they're using these kind of mats. It looks like thin shreds of wood that are kind of, shred or not. I don't know. They're long. I think that's not a bad idea for erosion control, but whether any of the seeds could come up through it, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's like a coconut fiber and something else mixed into those mats is what I've heard. Do you want to read the next part of that?
Yeah. The next part of this question is, how does cost figure into changing the roadsides? Less mowing, but will that be enough to offset the costs of removing invasives and introducing natives? There are so many roadsides, especially insoles are filled with knotweed, etc.
Well, if you took all the people, and like I said, it's really hard to get DOT road crews to give you a number. A couple years ago, I was interviewed by the Christian Science Monitor in Massachusetts, was doing a story on the restoring natives on roadsides in the Massachusetts DOT, and she could not get out of them what their mowing budget was. But there are a lot of humans, salaries being paid who are mowing full time, those big machines, and the cost of fuel. It's a huge budget, and other states have definitely had a cost reduction because they're not doing all that mowing. And like I said, to me, it's not putting these guys out of work. They could instead, with their mowers, just keep, drive up and down the road. Every time they see Japanese knotweed or honeysuckle, get in there and mow it, because that if you're going to do it manually versus with herbicides, mowing it every 2 weeks is what you need to do to really set it back. So, it's more, they're always saying we don't have the resources to deal with the invasives because they're so busy mowing away what I consider a lot of desirable species. So it's happening in other states. So it's doable, but do I know what the budget is? One of the things that I know happened in Maine with their roadside crew that was very frustrating for Bob Mooseman, the vegetation manager, was under LePage's administration, they laid off a lot of state road employees and instead all did it with subcontractors. So he instead spent all his time driving around, making sure the subcontractor was doing what they were supposed to doing, as opposed to having his whole team who he could train, to care. Like other states, like Vermont has done a better job with their roadsides. And they have, some great DOT people who are, they have their like section of the road and they get to know the plants there and are dedicated to taking care of it. But it's really hard to do that with subcontractors doing a lot of the work. And I'm sure it's still that way. So I know that was very frustrating to him. He sort of didn't have his boys anymore. It was like, it was just, he had to drive around making sure, looking at the contract and was the contractor doing what was on the contractor. It was a real waste.
Gosh. Let's see. So next question is from Elaine. Does salt compromise any of the natives, lupine, black-eyed coneflower? Are there any you recommend for salt conditions?
Yeah, a lot of our plants from the coast are very salt tolerant, especially because the salt's happening in the winter time. And typically, well, with climate change, we'll see, we have plenty of rain in the spring that actually washes it away. It's the trees and shrubs that really get hammered by the salt. versus the herbaceous plants. So yes, there's plenty that tolerate that. And typically a lot of the ones that like dry, sandy, gravelly soil or seaside plants. Seaside Goldenrod actually makes an excellent roadside plant. And there's even a paved over median on a bridge here in Portland. It's completely paved over. It's only 2 feet wide. And there's Seaside Goldenrod sprouting in the cracks. Looks beautiful, happy as can be. So we do
That's
have plants
wonderful.
that can tolerate the salt. It would still be great if we could lessen the amount of salt, because that's very damaging too.
Mhm.
You know, we've just all gotten so used to, no matter what the weather, thinking we should get in our cars and drive somewhere, and it creates a lot of problems.
Mhm. Kathleen would like to know, do the benefits of planting pollinator plants on roadsides to pollinators outweigh the dangers of attracting them to an area where they can be killed by fast-moving cars?
Yes, and there's plenty of research, again, not done in Maine, but in other states. This is all the things that people say why you can't do that. This either they say the deer or the sight lines or the pollinators. Yes, it is true. There will be more insects, just like there used to be on the side of the road even 30 years ago. In general, the pollinators, if there's plenty on their side of the road, they'll just go up and down the highway versus say, oh, I want to cut across the road. But a little bit of that will happen. But if we have healthier populations of the insects, you know, that will be better than no insects, which is what we have now. You know, those of us who are older remember, you know, it was through the 90s that, man, your car in the summer, you had to have the, you know, windshield wipers on, you know, every half an hour when you were driving in the summertime, because there were so many squished insects on the side of the road. Now you never have to do that. You know, it's really quite shocking. But yes, that was one of the concerns I remember hearing early on in one of the meetings, because a lot of the DOT were particularly, you know, the monarch butterfly has really charmed the general public, and including a lot of the DOT road crews, because they were pretty excited. Milkweed's such an easy plant to learn to recognize, and so they were really, you know, all excited that they knew what it was and they'd mow around it. But then they're like, but if monarchs come, then one might get squished by my car. So some of that's going to happen. But if we have a lot healthier insect populations, that's the best thing we can hope for.
Awesome. That's really good to hear. So next question from Sandra is, would it help to ask our community leaders for a smallish area and a very visible area as a starting point?
Yeah, well, there's two things. Like, one of the things would be great, especially like on the Blue Hill Peninsula, would be to maybe get out in June, because usually on secondary roads, it's sort of July when it seems like they start coming through and mowing. So getting out in June and seeing where you see native plants, and, you know, hey, Wild Seed Project, we sell a great sign, you know, that says native habitat, do not mow, you know, stick that up and, you know, make it so, or mark it off. So at least when the road crews come through, you know, part of it is letting the plants grow on the side of the road so we can see who still is there. A researcher in the University of Rhode Island wanted to figure that out, and she went and marked out plots just on the side of the highway, you know, in the turf, and identified all the species. And she was shocked, you know, because this was an area that was mowed regularly, still the number of native species that were still persisting in there. And so we still have species in here, but we've got to let them grow and flower to know that. And the summer we were in 2017 and 18, another part of the DOT also gave a big grant out to the Maine Natural Areas Program, and they were studying pollinators in a couple sections of the highway on the side of the road. So somewhere they have that data. But yes, depending, it's planting in some areas, but in other areas, it's just letting it grow. And then also, seeing where there are invasives and, luckily the invasives aren't hard to identify. That's where it's really training the mowing people to just mow the invasives and assume everything else is good. So they could just mow their one little narrow strip on the side of the road for the sight line, and then focus on mowing every time they hit a patch of Japanese knotweed and assume most of the other vegetation is good. And then get community members out to, and now where there's so many great apps with your phones, it's getting easier and easier to identify plants. It's really quite amazing. So that's a great way that land trust and community people can, but yeah, especially if there's another area in a visible area where they want to plant, you definitely got to start small, because it takes good site preparation. Weeds and invasive species, you have to get rid of them before you can plant the native species in there. The reason they're called weeds is they're annuals mostly, and they grow much faster than the native seedlings.
I feel like you just addressed the last question that we've received, which is, you expressed concern about scraping the ditches, but isn't it necessary to remove all the weedy vegetation before introducing native species?
Yeah, but I certainly wouldn't do it by scraping it away. So like there's a lot of times when they're putting a new interchange in or something where they have done major construction and they're dealing with dirt, like that is a perfect example of where it would be great. So let's say they finish that interchange in June, then what you could do for the summer is cover crop it with buckwheat or annual red clover, some fast growing, green manure plant that would grow faster than the weeds and hold the soil in place. And then get ready to seed it later in the fall, assuming you've gotten rid of all the invasive species. If you go to the Wild Seed Project website and read our blog on how to establish a meadow, that walks you through the process of this too. And then some of it's also in the Roadside manual. But gouging it out and scraping it all away is very destructive, and it just causes erosion. I mean, you look how often they have to do it. Those ditches then fill in. There's so many reasons not to do it that way. And other states in northern places, I'll use Vermont as an example, again, they don't do that, and they have a lot worse weather than we do. It's just become habit, and it's changing habits, and now that's the trick. So I'm sure there's situations where it might need to be done, but it's so widely done, and it's very destructive. And it, like I said, it has introduced a lot of, in the gravel, a lot of invasive species.
Well, thank you, Heather. We've had a few more questions come in. I'll check the time. We have about 6 minutes left. So we'll just use up that time, I guess. From Becky, they say, on our roads, our commissioner is worried about plants invading the road surface, so they dig the culverts out. And then they say, how can we avoid that so our plants will survive?
Well, and I guess I don't know what they think that the plants are going to invade the road system. Like I said, of course, you might need to mow one strip right on the side of the road. And there's a few areas, the most common tall plant on the side of the road is the exotic tall white clover. It's an agricultural weed. And what I find, so like, that's one of their big fears, is they don't want something 6 foot tall right on the side of the road. Most of our native plants don't do that, and they certainly don't do that in one growing season. But there are some weeds that do it, the tall white clover. But what usually happens is they mow in July, and then that clover actually comes up later. There's a lot of it on Route 1, like right in Orleans. They've already mowed, and then it comes up, like I think the plant has adapted to come up and be taller. Then another one of their concerns was always the forest is going to grow back. The forest is going to grow back. The forest does not grow back. That I wish the forest grew back in one season, but it doesn't. So it's really just a misunderstanding, which again was the big purpose of the guide, which was so even they can mow that 20-foot inslope in late October, early November, and the next year it's not going to get that tall. It's just not. The native plants don't do that. But if there's Japanese knotweed, that will be that tall, so they can mow that one.
The next question is about Japanese knotweed. Would you say that that's the best way to rid or even reduce a roadside of Japanese knotweed?
Yeah, Japanese knotweed has an incredible root system, and so it's persistent. You can do it without herbicides with repeated mowing, but you really got to mow it like every 2 weeks, or if it's in your yard, you can just whack it back every 2 weeks. It's a great one to get kids to work on, get them out there whacking it all the time. The mistake people often make is they mow it once and then they let it grow back. And with the impressive root system as it has, it will take 3 to 5 years of just repeated mowing. But not, over time it can lessen. And another great resource we have on the Wild Seed Project website is, the invasives native species to plant after removing invasives. And it's a PDF, it's on our website. And purple flowering raspberry is a native shrub that once you have set the knotweed back, and it doesn't even have to be all gone, you can add purple flowering raspberry and just keep whacking the knotweed back, and it will eventually, the purple flowering raspberry will dominate. And there are other species that you can do that with too. But like I said, the DOT, it's interesting because there are areas on the interstate where they have successfully, usually they're using herbicides, they've gone in, but when they're using herbicides, if they're gonna do that, you gotta follow through and not just do it once. It's like doing chemotherapy and just showing up for one session and then saying, I'm not going to do it, you've got to follow through. But you can do it mechanically too. It just takes more persistence. But, I'm not suggesting that any of the people that have a job mowing the roadside shouldn't have a job anymore. They can focus that mowing energy on the invasives.
Totally. Thanks, Heather. It looks like we have one more question in the chat box. Oh, can you guys still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. One more question in the chat box, and it's almost time. So I think we have time for this last one from Caroline. This question isn't about roadsides, but what recommendations for planting leach fields?
Yeah, a lot. Well, mostly herbaceous species in general. You're not supposed to plant trees on leach field, especially ones with bigger root systems, but any of the meadow species. And this guide would totally be useful for that too. Look for the species. Hopefully your leach field has dry, sandy, gravelly soil. So just pick out all the species that like that. Also, the blog on the Wild Seed Project website, how to plant a meadow, will give you a great species list for that too. But I really encourage everyone to print out a copy of the manual and, go put it on, put it in your town library. We would love to be able to get this printed again. It's complicated because Bob Moosman has retired, and I don't know. we're hoping we could do that someday, but in the meantime, anyone can print it out for free and make use of it. So please do that and get it in the hands of the people who are doing this work. And it's not too wordy. We really tried to make it visual and short and sweet on the text so that people would actually read through it and use it and not, glaze over.
Awesome. I'm definitely going to bring it to the Blue Hill Public Library and share it with some friends I have working there. And if any of you out in the audience are interested potentially, and maybe Noelle will say the same thing, but in maybe working with a land trust on the Blue Hill Peninsula in a project such as this, feel free to reach out to me at lander@blueheritagetrust.org. I would have to consult with everyone else, of course, in the organization, but I would love to consider being a part of a project like this on the peninsula.
You know how else this could be really useful to land trust is land trust always have parking lots at all their trailheads. And often somebody just came in and dumped some gravel and there's not much on the edge. And you could totally use this guide to choose the species to plant on the side of the parking lot. Along with more, add more trees for shade so people don't get hot, their car isn't too hot when they do it.
It's a great idea.
It's a great idea.
Thank you so much, Heather, for being with us tonight. This is so fabulous. I feel really grateful that we get to learn from you. And for those of you wondering, we will share the recording. It will be up on our website as well as the Island Heritage Trust, I believe. So if you would like to share it, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
And Heather, I'll send you the link as well, so you have it.
Okay, great.
All right, have a great night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Heather, you're still there, right?
Yeah.
Cool. Just a quick kind of housekeeping question. Did you receive the checks from our organizations yet?
Oh, I don't know, because they would have gone to the office mailbox. So I will ask Jen when they came. When did you mail them out?
Again, I'm not quite sure because Beth manages that on our end.
Yeah.
So I could check with her, but I assume that they've been mailed out. But just if they haven't, if you guys could let us know,
Okay.
I'll make sure that it happens.
Yes, I'll ask Jen about that.
And I know that Julia sent them to you, Lander, like today.
Perfect. Awesome. Okay. So maybe they haven't gone out yet, Heather, but they will then shortly, I'm sure, and I'll touch base with Beth about that.
Okay. Great.
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 Thank you so much.
Thank you guys. And
thank you so much, Heather.
And hope to see you this summer when I'm up there more.
Yeah, please look us up.
I will.
All right. Take care. Bye.